The steady hum of the early morning was broken by the harsh growl of a chainsaw. It was a noise I had grown accustomed to, but today it felt different, jarring, as if it were invading my peaceful sanctuary. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented. I thought I was still dreaming, but the persistent buzz outside pulled me to full consciousness. I sat up in bed, the cool morning air brushing my skin, and listened as the noise continued to grow louder, closer. Then came the unmistakable sound of wood cracking, followed by a series of loud, sharp thuds. Something was wrong. I wheeled myself over to the window and peeked out, my heart sinking when my eyes locked on the scene below. There she was, Karen Whitmore, standing in the driveway, the very picture of smug satisfaction. She was watching as a group of workers dismantled my wheelchair ramp, their tools tearing through the wood with vicious precision. It was my ramp, the one thing that allowed me to get out of my house without needing anyone to help me. The one thing that meant I could leave the confines of these four walls when I wanted to, without depending on anyone else to carry me down the stairs. And now, it was being destroyed right before my eyes. I felt a cold wave of frustration and anger rise within me, tightening my chest. This wasn't just a simple removal of a structure. No, this felt personal. I could see it in Karen's expression, her satisfaction as she stood over the wreckage, her arms crossed in that arrogant manner of hers. It wasn't enough that she had already imposed so many ridiculous rules on the neighborhood. She had to take it a step further. She had to destroy something that meant so much to me. I threw open the window with a force that surprised even me, my voice cutting through the air as I shouted, "What the hell do you think you're doing, Karen?" Karen barely glanced over, her lips curling into a smirk that seemed almost rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for this confrontation her whole life. "Oh, look who's awake," she said, with a tone that dripped with sarcasm. "About time, considering you don't have a job or anything important to do." She flicked her hand toward the workers. "Make sure you get all of it. We don't need these ugly structures ruining our community's appearance." Ugly structures. She was calling my wheelchair ramp ugly, the very thing that allowed me a semblance of independence. I couldn't hold it in anymore. "That ramp was built legally," I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. "You have no right to tear it down." Karen rolled her eyes, her condescending laugh filling the space between us. "Oh, please. Rules override whatever nonsense you think you have. And guess what? We had a vote. The neighborhood agrees it has to go." A vote? That was rich. I knew how Karen's votes worked. She and her two cronies made all the decisions behind closed doors and acted like the entire community had signed off on them. I had never been asked for my opinion, let alone anyone else in the neighborhood. It was just another manipulation tactic. I looked over at the workers, two men in orange vests who seemed increasingly uncomfortable as they continued tearing apart my ramp. I could tell they weren't happy about what they were doing. They were just following orders, but they were fully aware of how wrong this was. "You might want to stop," I warned them, "because when I take legal action, you'll be held responsible too." Karen let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Legal action from you? What are you going to do? File a complaint?" She took a step closer to the window, her eyes gleaming with a sense of triumph. "This is my neighborhood, my rules. You're just some guy taking up space." Her words stung, but they didn't break me. What she didn't know was that she was making a grave mistake. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She had no idea what I could do, or how the tide was about to turn in my favor. That afternoon, after Karen and her crew finished their destructive work, I sat in my living room, my mind still racing with anger. Claire, my assistant, bustled into the room, looking just as furious as I felt. "I called the city," she said, dropping a stack of papers onto my desk. "They confirmed everything you said. That ramp was completely legal. Karen has no authority to do what she just did." I let out a breath, rubbing my temple. She thinks she's untouchable. Well, she's about to find out otherwise. As I scanned through the documents Claire handed me, I felt a slow smile tug at my lips. The first step of her downfall had already begun. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The warmth of the sun filtered through the blinds as I sat at the window, staring out at the busy street. The world outside was bustling with life, the distant hum of cars, children's laughter, the rustling of leaves. A part of me longed to be a part of it all, to walk down the street without needing help, to feel the earth beneath my feet. But that wasn't my reality. I leaned back, feeling the familiar weight of the chair beneath me. It was a feeling that had become second nature, but also a constant reminder of the life I could never fully live on my own terms. Years before, I was someone who could walk like everyone else. It was easy to forget that sometimes, even for me. But the accident changed everything. I'd spent months in physical therapy, struggling to regain even the slightest bit of mobility. It wasn't just the physical pain that hurt. It was the sense of helplessness that slowly gnawed away at my soul. My independence was slipping through my fingers, and I had no control over it. The first time I truly felt the crushing weight of my disability was after my release from the hospital. I was home, but I wasn't truly home. My house had stairs just like everyone else's, and with every step, I realized how impractical it was, how my mobility had been limited to nothing but a series of barriers. There was no way for me to leave the house on my own, no way to do anything without someone helping me. I'd never felt more isolated. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't going to wait for people to pity me. I wasn't going to sit in this house stagnant forever. I called contractors, explained my situation, and within weeks, construction began on a wheelchair ramp that would give me freedom again. It wasn't just a physical structure, it was a lifeline, a symbol of the independence I craved. As the ramp was being built, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't experienced in months. This was my way of fighting back against the limitations that had been forced upon me. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. But that small victory was exactly what Karen Whitmore couldn't stand. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood, had always been an issue, even before my accident. From the very first time I met her, I could tell she had a need to control everything around her. She wasn't just another homeowner. She was the president of the HOA, and she wore it like a badge of honor, as though it gave her some sort of power over everyone else. She had her cronies, those who followed her every command and did her bidding without question. If you didn't fit her narrow vision of what the neighborhood should look like, you were a target. I remember the first time she came to my door after I'd finished the ramp. She had a look in her eyes that was equal parts condescending and threatening. "You do know that ramp isn't allowed, right?" she asked, voice dripping with feigned sweetness. I hadn't even responded before she launched into a lecture about how things had to fit in with the neighborhood's aesthetic. She made it clear that any deviation from her idea of perfection was unacceptable. Her voice echoed in my mind as I stood by the window watching her again. Her words had never really left me. "This isn't what we want for our community." What she really meant was that she didn't want anyone challenging her vision of the world, especially not me. She didn't just want conformity, she demanded it. But it wasn't just me she had her sights set on. She had spent years making life miserable for everyone in the neighborhood. There was the elderly couple down the street who had been fined for painting their door a shade of blue that didn't match the approved color scheme. There was the single mother around the corner who had received a $200 fine because her son played outside for too long one afternoon. All of them had been pushed around by Karen's rules, and most of them were too afraid to speak up. But that wasn't me. I wasn't going to let her run my life. It wasn't long before I learned that Karen wasn't just about aesthetics. She had made it her mission to clean up the neighborhood, to enforce her idea of perfect living. Arbitrary fines for things like garden gnomes or parking too close to a curb were her specialty. No one was safe from her overreach. I had witnessed firsthand how she made people feel small, powerless. But that was before I realized the extent of her control. One evening, Karen showed up unannounced at my door again, this time with her usual arrogance, but there was a coldness to her smile. "It's time for that ramp to come down," she said. The words stung, more than I cared to admit. She looked at me like I didn't matter, like I was nothing more than a problem she was ready to solve. I forced myself to stay calm, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the doorframe. "You don't have the authority to do that," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "That ramp was built with the proper permits." Karen rolled her eyes. "Permits don't matter when you're ruining the neighborhood's image," she replied dismissively. "I'm not going to let you keep that eyesore." I clenched my jaw, trying to suppress the surge of anger that rushed through me. "It's not just an eyesore, it's my access to the world outside. Without it, I'm stuck in this house." She smiled. I'm sure you'll find another way, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Maybe you could hire someone to carry you up and down the stairs. Oh, wait, you don't have anyone to do that, do you? Her words cut deeper than I let on. I knew she wanted me to feel helpless, but I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. You're making a mistake, I said. You're violating the law. The ramp was approved. You can't just tear it down because you don't like it. Her smirk widened. I can do whatever I want. The neighborhood voted, and we decided it has to go. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that she had the audacity to lie about a vote or the fact that she had so little regard for the people who lived here. But her words were clear. This wasn't about rules or laws. This was about control. I slammed the door shut in her face, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't let this go, and I wasn't going to back down. That night, I called Claire. She was more than my assistant. She was a friend, someone who had stuck by me through the toughest times. I explained what had happened, and she immediately started digging into the legalities of the situation. We researched Karen's previous actions, her misuse of power, and her manipulation of HOA funds. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't just a personal vendetta against me. This was a broader issue of abuse of power. We can take legal action, Claire said, after a long pause. She can't just do whatever she wants. The ramp is legally yours, and she's in violation of the law. Tension simmered in the air as I realized we were on the verge of something bigger than just a fight over a ramp. This was going to be a battle for my independence, for justice, and for everything Karen had taken from so many people in the neighborhood. I wasn't going to let her push me around any longer. This fight was just beginning. The day after Karen's brazen attack on the ramp, I spent the morning pacing around my living room. Every part of my body wanted to snap, to lash out, but I knew that the only way to really make her pay was through the law. It wasn't enough to just confront her in public, to shout from my window. I needed to hit her where it hurt. Her carefully crafted kingdom of deceit. Claire was already on it. She'd made calls, dug into records, and pulled documents that had remained buried for too long. I could see her rummaging through piles of paperwork as she sat at my desk, tapping away at her laptop. "You're gonna want to see this," she said, her voice just a little too calm. She had that quiet confidence that made me know she wasn't going to come to me with just a rumor or a gut feeling. When Claire had something to show, it was always solid. I rolled over to her, leaning in to see what was on the screen. My eyes scanned over the documents that were slowly revealing the depths of Karen's corruption. Claire scrolled down the page. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a transaction history from the HOA's financial account. "That's over $10,000 for community improvements. Guess what that improvement was? A 5-star vacation to the Maldives. Here's another one. $2,000 for beautification projects. It was for a spa retreat in the mountains." I read further, disbelief and rage mixing in my chest. It wasn't just that she was pocketing the money. She'd been using the HOA funds to fund her lifestyle. "She's been doing this for years, hasn't she?" I muttered, shaking my head in disbelief. "Yep. And she's done it with the full knowledge of the board members who have been too scared to say anything. They thought she was untouchable." Claire leaned back in her chair. "But we have the proof now. All we need is the right strategy." The moment I saw that evidence, something inside me shifted. I hadn't realized how much I'd been weighed down by Karen's actions until that very moment. All of a sudden, it wasn't just about the ramp anymore. It was about taking her down for everything she had done to this neighborhood and to me. I looked at Claire. "We go public with this. Every single piece of evidence goes straight to the courthouse, the press, the city council, and anyone who's been wronged by her. No more hiding, no more pretending she's in charge." Claire's eyes narrowed. "I like where your head's at, but we can't do this half-hearted. If we're going to take her down, we need to be strategic." I nodded. "We've got to make sure she knows we're in this for the long haul. She thinks she's got everything under control, but she doesn't know what's coming." Claire smiled slightly. "That's the spirit. I'll start drafting the legal paperwork. You focus on how you want to play this. Make her think you're not fighting back yet." The thought of Karen's smug face, her casual dismissal of my rights, made my blood boil. But I'd learned a long time ago that emotional reactions didn't win battles. Precision did. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, focusing on the task at hand. Karen had no idea what she was walking into. With every new legal document we filed, I felt more empowered. Claire was busy pulling every string she could to get the court's attention. We weren't just preparing for a lawsuit, we were setting a trap, one where Karen's arrogance would be her downfall. Every meeting, every conversation with the lawyers felt like a step closer to victory. One morning, Claire burst into my office, waving an envelope in the air. "It's official," she said, grinning. "The lawsuit is going forward. The court's already scheduled a hearing. It's happening." I leaned back in my chair, allowing the weight of what we'd accomplished to settle in. We weren't just fighting for my ramp anymore. We were fighting for everyone who had ever been steamrolled by her, for every injustice Karen had inflicted. This wasn't just about winning for myself. It was about winning for the entire neighborhood. And yet, I wasn't done yet. I hadn't fully let go of the years of feeling like an outsider in my own community. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. But I wasn't about to stop until every last piece of her false authority crumbled. As the days passed, the case began to feel less like something I was doing and more like something that was simply going to happen. Karen's downfall had already been written, and we were just going through the motions until the final chapter. With each legal step we took, I felt the scales tipping in my favor. It wasn't just the documents or the evidence. It was the realization that I wasn't the underdog anymore. Karen was, and I was going to make sure that everyone knew it. There was a certain power that came with knowing you had the truth on your side. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen had been hiding behind lies for so long that she'd convinced herself she was invincible. She wasn't. This time, it wasn't just a fight for my right to live independently. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been bullied, manipulated, or taken advantage of. Karen had no idea what was coming. I leaned forward, a determined smile tugging at my lips. "It's time. We're going to take her down." Claire glanced at me, her eyes gleaming with the same confidence I was starting to feel. "Let's do it." And in that moment, the weight of everything we'd been through, the frustration, the anger, the helplessness, all turned into something new, confidence. And with that confidence, I knew exactly how to play this game. Inside the courthouse, the heavy silence was interrupted only by the sound of Karen's high heels clicking across the floor. She stormed in with her usual confident swagger, but there was a distinct unease beneath her forced composure. She had always believed she was untouchable, the center of her own little universe. But today, something was different. Her usual air of superiority seemed more fragile, her smirk not quite as secure. As Karen strutted toward the front, the protagonist rolled in behind the judge's bench, the chair's wheels clicking in stark contrast to Karen's steps. The moment Karen looked up, her eyes widened and she froze. The smug expression melted away as she realized who had taken the seat of authority. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," the protagonist said evenly, their voice calm and composed. The room fell into a deep silence. For the first time, Karen was speechless. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of the moment. Karen finally found her voice, though it cracked slightly with disbelief. "This is a mistake," she muttered under her breath, but it was no use. The protagonist's presence behind the bench had shifted everything. The tables had turned. The protagonist's cold gaze met hers. Not a hint of emotion, just the unmistakable authority of someone in control. "You are here today for a formal hearing regarding the misappropriation of HOA funds, as well as multiple counts of fraudulent activity," they stated, flipping through the papers in front of them. "Based on the evidence provided, there are also numerous complaints regarding your misuse of power, excessive fines, and direct destruction of private property." Karen blinked, her arrogance briefly flaring up before she struggled to regain her usual confident stance. "This is ridiculous. None of this is true. I've been doing my job," she spat, but there was an edge of panic creeping into her voice. The protagonist didn't flinch. "Let's start with the evidence, Mrs. Whitmore." A resident was called to the stand, a retired veteran who had been fined several times for ridiculous infractions. He described how Karen had repeatedly fined him for trivial things like his flagpole, even though it was well within legal limits. "She told me my flagpole was unsightly," the veteran testified, shaking his head in disbelief. "I'm just a man who fought for this country. I didn't deserve that." Karen's face twisted in frustration, her shoulders stiffening. That's just one person's complaint, she sneered. There are rules, and I enforce them. The protagonist nodded, uninterested in her excuses. Let's move on, they said, directing attention to the next witness. A young mother took the stand, describing how Karen had fined her for letting her child play outside in the afternoon. My daughter was just playing. It was a violation of noise, she said. The fine was outrageous. Karen leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms, but her discomfort was palpable. These people don't respect the rules, she muttered under her breath, though no one was buying it. Another witness, a neighbor who had been fined for having an unsightly garden gnome, stood up. She told me it didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood, but I thought it was cute, harmless. It didn't hurt anyone. The protagonist glanced over the testimonies with cold precision, unfazed by Karen's increasing agitation. They turned to the next page, bringing up the financial report, the key piece of evidence. According to HOA financial reports, there seems to be a discrepancy in the allocation of funds. Thousands of dollars listed under community improvements appear to have been redirected to your personal accounts. Care to explain this? Karen's face flushed with anger, her fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand as she stammered. That's not what happened. Everything I did was for the community. Her voice wavered. The protagonist remained silent for a moment, letting the tension build before gesturing for the clerk to play the audio recording. The room was filled with Karen's voice, and a cold chill spread over the courtroom as her words echoed through the speakers. It's not stealing if I'm the president. That's called a perk of the job. The silence that followed was deafening. The entire room, from the jury to the onlookers, stared at her, some in disbelief, others with a smug satisfaction. That's taken out of context, Karen snapped, her face contorted in an ugly mix of anger and panic. The protagonist leaned forward, their gaze unwavering. Would you like to provide the full context? Karen was silent for a long moment. I was joking, she muttered, though it was clear no one believed her. A second witness, a former HOA board member, testified about how Karen had spent thousands of HOA dollars on personal vacations, fine dining, and even luxury spa treatments. She said the funds were for security upgrades and beautification projects, but none of that happened. She used our money for her own benefit. By now, Karen's usual bluster was completely gone. She shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the jury. The protagonist continued methodically, turning the pages of the case file. They weren't rushed, they weren't intimidated. Every word was delivered with the authority that came with being in control. Another resident stood up, recounting how Karen had fined him repeatedly for trivial matters. Incorrect curtain color, parking too close to a curb, and in one instance for something as silly as owning a lawn gnome that was too whimsical. Karen shot him a glare, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to defend herself. These are all legitimate infractions. People don't appreciate maintaining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Let's move on, the protagonist said, the edge of impatience creeping into their tone. The case was becoming clear, and they knew it wouldn't be long before Karen had nowhere left to hide. The final piece of evidence was the most damning, a bank statement listing thousands of dollars in HOA funds withdrawn at a luxury resort in Cancun, under Karen's name. The dates aligned perfectly with the time she claimed to be overseeing community security upgrades. The protagonist slid the document across the desk toward Karen. Would you care to explain this? They asked, their voice cool and unyielding. Karen's face twisted in rage, her lips trembling as she tried to concoct an excuse. I was scouting locations for a possible neighborhood retreat, she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. The courtroom erupted in quiet laughter, with even the judge trying to hide his grin. The protagonist allowed the moment to sink in before speaking. Mrs. Whitmore, based on the overwhelming evidence, it is clear that you have engaged in fraudulent activity, the misuse of funds, and abuse of power. You've violated HOA regulations and committed legal offenses that warrant further investigation. Karen's face drained of all color, her last attempt to hold on to any semblance of control utterly shattered. She glared at the protagonist, her mouth opening and closing, desperate for something, anything to hold on to. Before the protagonist could issue the final ruling, Karen's voice trembled with a final weak protest. This is personal. You're doing this because of the ramp. she hissed, her eyes burning with fury. The protagonist met her gaze coolly. The law doesn't operate on personal grudges, Mrs. Whitmore. It operates on facts, and the facts are not in your favor. Karen's mouth snapped shut as the full weight of the situation hit her. She was cornered, and she knew it. There would be no escaping this. The protagonist turned to the court. Given the severity of the violations, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiffs. Mrs. Whitmore is hereby ordered to repay all misappropriated funds, relinquish her position as HOA president, and vacate her residence within 30 days. Additionally, due to the evidence of financial misconduct, this case will be referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation. Karen let out a strangled gasp. "You can't do this," she screamed. "This is my neighborhood." The protagonist's voice was final, their expression unwavering. "Not anymore." The gavel slammed down with a resounding thud. It was over. The courtroom was silent as I slowly placed the file in front of me. The tension in the air was palpable, the weight of what was about to happen heavy on everyone's shoulders. I cleared my throat, my voice steady and professional as I began to speak. After reviewing the evidence presented, including testimony from multiple witnesses, financial records, and recorded admissions, it is clear that you, Mrs. Whitmore, have engaged in fraudulent activity. You misappropriated HOA funds for personal use under the guise of community improvement projects, and you imposed fines on residents without basis, solely for your own personal gain and control. I paused, locking eyes with Karen, who had remained eerily silent until now. Her smug expression faltered just for a moment, but it was enough to remind me why this moment felt so satisfying. You are hereby ordered to repay all misappropriated funds, relinquish your position as HOA president, and vacate your residence within 30 days. Furthermore, given the gravity of your actions, this case will be referred to the district attorney's office for further investigation. I let the silence settle in as Karen's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed, unable to form words, her gaze flickering between me and the courtroom, searching for a lifeline that was no longer there. "No," she finally muttered, almost too quietly for anyone to hear. "This is a mistake. You can't do this." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. I remained impassive. "This is not a mistake, Mrs. Whitmore. This is the law." A low murmur ran through the room. The sound of the gavel echoing in my ears felt almost surreal. Karen had tried to manipulate every person in this community, but the law, facts, and truth had caught up with her. The gavel struck, sealing her fate. For a moment, Karen just stood there, frozen, her mind working overtime as if trying to find a way out. She was clearly desperate, and I could see the panic growing behind her eyes. The power she once had was slipping through her fingers, and the reality of her downfall was finally sinking in. Her voice cracked as she looked at me. "You're just doing this because of the ramp. You want revenge for that, don't you? This is personal." Her fingers trembled as she pointed at me, her fury now bordering on hysteria. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my gaze cool and steady. "This is not personal, Mrs. Whitmore. The law does not operate on grudges, it operates on facts, and the facts are not in your favor." Her mouth snapped shut, and for a brief moment she stood there struggling to find something, anything to say. But there was nothing left. No arguments, no manipulations, no more pretending. Just defeat. "Your actions have consequences," I said, my voice firm. "And today, those consequences have arrived." The following day, Karen stood on the steps of the courthouse, her face pale and taut with anger as the reality of her eviction began to settle in. She had been fighting it all morning, throwing threats and complaints at anyone who would listen. But there was no escaping the truth. The neighborhood had gathered outside, many of them watching the spectacle unfold. The sounds of Karen's final tantrums, her shouting, her futile protests, were drowned out by the sound of a construction crew working just down the street. Workers were putting together a new, fully approved wheelchair ramp for me. It was bigger, sturdier, and completely out of Karen's reach. As Karen stood by her car, clutching a few last items, her eyes burned with rage. She shot daggers at me, still trying to maintain some semblance of control. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" Karen hissed, her voice shrill and trembling. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. Behind her, the construction crew finished laying the final planks of the ramp. Neighbors gathered around, some offering me small nods of support, others quietly applauding the end of Karen's reign. The ramp stood as a silent testament to the struggle I had fought and won. It felt like a victory for everyone in the neighborhood. Karen had tormented them, just as she had tormented me, for far too long. And now, with her departure, they too could breathe freely. The oppressive weight she had placed on this community was gone. But Karen wasn't finished. As she climbed into her car, she cast one last venomous look at me. "You'll regret this," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "I'll make sure of it." I didn't flinch. I simply rolled up the ramp, a sense of peace settling in as I reached the top. My new ramp, approved, legal, and built with the support of the community, was now mine. And with it, I stood, not as a victim, but as someone who had taken back control of their own life. Karen's world had crumbled around her, and she was now a mere shadow of the person who once believed she was untouchable. And as I looked back one last time at the crowd gathering near her car, I couldn't help but smile. The neighborhood was finally free. As Karen's moving truck pulled away, her face twisted in fury. I could hear the faint sound of applause coming from the crowd behind me. It wasn't a hero's welcome, but it didn't need to be. The justice of the situation was enough. Claire turned to me, her grin wide and satisfied. "I have to say," she said, her tone light, "this is better than I could have ever imagined." I nodded, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting from my shoulders. Justice has a way of catching up to people, no matter how much they think they can outrun it. The final image lingered in my mind as I watched the last of Karen's belongings disappear into the moving truck. The neighborhood was finally free of her oppressive grip. The ramp that had once been a symbol of struggle now stood proudly as a symbol of victory, of resilience, of justice, and of a community that refused to be silenced. And with that, I knew the war was over. Karen had lost, and I had won. The sound of birds chirping and the soft hum of the neighborhood felt almost surreal. It had been weeks since Karen's downfall, and things had changed. The air was lighter. The streets seemed quieter, freer. No longer was there a shadow cast over the community by her oppressive rules. For the first time in years, residents felt they could breathe. From the moment Karen's reign crumbled, the transformation was almost immediate. People had once feared the HOA president's constant surveillance and her brutal fines, but now they were reclaiming their space. The lawns, once bare and meticulously uniform, now boasted a variety of colors and decorations. A couple down the block proudly placed a colorful garden gnome near their front steps, a bold, playful addition that would have earned them a fine under Karen's rule. Nearby, a young couple set up a hammock in their front yard, something that would have been considered too eccentric before. Now they laughed together under the shade, unbothered by the oppressive weight of arbitrary rules. Even children, who once had to be careful when they played outside, could now run free without fear of receiving fines for something as trivial as running too loud. A group of kids gathered in a yard, tossing a frisbee back and forth, their laughter filling the air as if the neighborhood had been holding its breath for years, waiting for a reason to let go. And now, with Karen gone, it finally could. For many, these small victories meant everything. They had lived for so long under Karen's thumb, having to carefully monitor every aspect of their lives to avoid her wrath. But with her departure, they realized they had more freedom than they ever thought possible. The streets felt like home again, not a place to survive in fear of authority. And as the neighborhood began to feel like a community once more, Karen was not faring as well. From the moment she packed up her things and left, it was clear she was struggling to let go of the control she had once wielded. As she drove away, her car's tires screeched down the street, and a bitter expression was etched on her face, her power slipping from her fingers like sand. "I'll appeal," Karen muttered to herself, her voice cracking with frustration as she threw a final glance at the neighborhood that had once belonged to her. "I'll fight this. You haven't seen the last of me." But it was over. The people had spoken, and the law had upheld their right to live free from tyranny. Karen could try to hold on to her illusions of power, but it was only a matter of time before she realized she was fighting a losing battle. Inside the protagonist's home, the day had been quiet. A sense of satisfaction hung in the air, like the calm after a storm. Claire, always the observant one, couldn't help but smile. Justice, huh? I'd say you've earned this. The protagonist nodded, leaning back in their chair. I didn't just fight for myself, I fought for everyone who was tired of living under her rule. They glanced out the window, where the sun now bathed the street in golden light. But it feels surreal. I used to fear the knock on the door, wondering when she'd come with another fine or when she'd tell me I couldn't do something because it didn't fit her version of the perfect neighborhood. Now, it's all gone. Claire watched their face soften, a quiet sense of peace settling over them. You didn't just win the case. You helped change everything. The protagonist sighed, deep and slow. I didn't think it would feel like this. For so long, I just wanted to be left alone. I wanted my independence, but Karen made everything feel impossible. I didn't think it could ever be any different. But now, they paused, as if taking in the reality of it all. Now, everything has changed, for all of us. They looked back at Claire, a knowing expression on their face. We always think that justice is something distant, something that happens to others far away. But the truth is, it's right here, and sometimes we have to fight for it, even when we think we're too small to win. Claire smiled softly, placing a hand on the protagonist's shoulder. You fought for it, and you showed everyone that you didn't have to back down. The protagonist chuckled, their tone light but determined. I may be in a chair, but Karen didn't have any more power over me than I allowed her to. The law doesn't bend for people like her, and it won't bend for anyone else. You can't control others forever, no matter how much you think you're above them. Their gaze moved back to the window, where the neighborhood was flourishing, each house standing as a testament to the newfound freedom the residents now shared. I never thought I'd see the day when Karen would be gone, but I guess the universe has a funny way of making sure justice catches up with people no matter how hard they try to outrun it. As they spoke, the sound of the construction crew working on the new ramp outside filled the air. A simple, yet profound reminder of how far they had come. The ramp was nearly finished now, wider, smoother, and more accessible than before. The neighbors had gathered around, a quiet hum of approval in the background. Claire watched the progress outside, her eyes glimmering with satisfaction. Looks like the ramp's finally getting the love it deserves, huh? The protagonist smiled, a hint of amusement in their eyes. Yeah, it's funny. Karen tried so hard to destroy it, and now it's better than it's ever been. In that moment, the protagonist felt a deep sense of fulfillment, like a weight had been lifted. The struggles, the fights, the injustices, they had all led to this. And it wasn't just their victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, and oppressed. The neighborhood was free, and they had played a part in making it so. I think this is what justice feels like, the protagonist murmured, more to themselves than anyone else. It's not always immediate, it's not always easy, but in the end it's worth it. As the sun set behind the houses, the protagonist wheeled out onto their new ramp, rolling smoothly down the path, finally feeling like they had truly claimed their space. No more fear. No more Karen. Only freedom. And for the first time in a long time, they could finally exhale. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. The sound of hammers and drills had long faded, replaced by an almost eerie silence as the construction crew put the finishing touches on the new ramp. The once dilapidated space was now transformed into something strong, solid, and beautiful. It was more than just a wheelchair ramp. It was a symbol of victory, of resilience, and of what happens when you refuse to let tyranny stand. The protagonist sat at the foot of the ramp, hands resting on the wheels of their chair, eyes scanning the horizon. The neighborhood, once burdened by Karen's oppressive presence, was now filled with an unmistakable sense of relief. The lawns looked brighter, the houses fresher, and the air seemed to carry a new energy, freedom. A few neighbors, their faces filled with quiet satisfaction, gathered near the edge of the yard, their conversations low but appreciative. It was clear that Karen's departure had left more than just an empty house behind. It had changed the pulse of the community. The protagonist couldn't help but notice how much more alive everything felt. With a deep breath, they pushed themselves forward, rolling up the ramp. The wheels turned smoothly, gliding effortlessly along the fresh wood, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no resistance, No struggle, just movement. Forward, unburdened. As the wheels met the top, the protagonist paused for a moment, gazing around at the scene. Behind them, the neighborhood was already starting to reclaim its freedom. Children played on front lawns without fear of being fined for the most ridiculous reasons. A few houses away, someone had already put up their Halloween decorations, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago under Karen's rule. Laughter echoed from the street as a couple of neighbors chatted, their voices filled with a sense of lightness that had been absent for far too long. The protagonist smiled, their eyes glimmering with quiet triumph. Justice had been done, not just in the courtroom, but here, in this neighborhood, where people were once silenced, afraid of speaking out. Now, the air felt lighter, the future more promising. No longer would anyone have to walk on eggshells, worried about Karen's arbitrary rules or her tyrannical grip. As they sat there, for just a moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. The fight for the ramp, the legal battle, the constant pressure, it all led to this. A small, personal victory that had turned into something much bigger. The protagonist had gained more than just their independence back. They had helped to restore something far more valuable, the sense of community. With a deep, contented sigh, the protagonist turned and glanced back at the street one last time. It was a neighborhood, not a dictatorship. And as they rolled away, the weight of the past few months lifted, replaced by something brighter, something hopeful. The world felt different now, like justice had finally taken its rightful place.